Welcome, everyone, to the sixth gathering of our spring Morehead-Cain event season and the third of our 7 talks. We've assembled a rich lineup of talks and discussions for you this spring, so we hope you'll have a look on the MCN to learn more and RSVP. For today's 7 talk, we are beyond delighted to welcome Julie Huffaker, class of 1991, as our speaker. Once you hear from her, you'll understand our excitement. Julie was one of the lead planners of the West Coast Symposium that was supposed to happen last March before COVID took us all in a different direction. Julie had some awesome interactive activities planned for that event, and we're hoping to be able to try some of them at the 2022 Alumni Forum in Chapel Hill. But meanwhile, we are delighted that Julie was willing to join us now, almost a year later, to share some of that magic and wisdom with all of us. Julie, thank you for being here.
I feel so inspired just looking out across your faces, seeing people and have worked with, I hold dear, have met during the process of working on the symposium. So I feel like our work here is done. I actually want to lean forward and just say something. I'm pretending that Megan's not in the room, so don't tell her what I'm about to say. I was shocked when she and Emily reached out, and Kim, and would be interested in doing a 7 talk. And the reason I was shocked is they asked me to do a 7 talk in one of the very first in-person gatherings, Alumni Forum in Chapel Hill. And I got so nervous. I went on so long, one of those out of body experiences where I was floating above myself and looking down at this little person on the stage, but I could see them in the back of the auditorium saying, 5 minutes left, 2 minutes left, 1 minute left, 30 seconds left, stop, cut it off. And then by the end, they were doing this. So I was pretty shocked when they reached out and also delighted. So I'm just going to ask you, Megan, officially, how much time do I have today?
You have 7 minutes, but you can take more because I think we're going to do some breakouts, right? Yeah, so let's do that.
Okay.
Talk.
Thank you. We're actually going to start with a little pre-search, and I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. Many of you are probably aware that this is the 3rd day of Women's History Month. And in honor of that, I wanted to share one of my favorite images from photographer Mary Ellen Mark from an exhibition called Women at Work, and then give you all just a little bit of pre-search to do, a little research before we dive into the conversation. And the conversation or the pre-search I'm going to give you actually has nothing to do with Mary Ellen Mark. I just took the opportunity to share that with you and remind us about all the different ways that women work hard around the world. Here are the 3 minutes of pre-search that I would like to ask you to do right now. I'd like to ask you to open a browser window somewhere device you're on and spend a few minutes, we'll all put ourselves on mute, looking up Mary Parker Follett. And I'm curious about how much you can find out from the World Wide Web about who she was and what she contributes around leadership. And here are a few hot tips. Mary Parker Follett, and integration and conflict and law of the situation, or just follow your nose out there. I'll time us for 3 minutes, and then we'll come back and use that as a launching point into talking about emerging and future forms of leadership and some of the challenges and benefits. All right, so I'm going to leave my screen up here for another minute while everybody begins their searches. You have 3 minutes. We've got 1 more minute. Fantastic. That's your 3 minutes. It is actually amazing what you can learn in 3 minutes on the internet. So I would love to do this. Having taken 3 minutes to research a little bit about Mary Parker Follett, I would love to ask our pilot, our Zoom pilot, Brendan, if he will send everybody into trios in breakout groups. And I'd like to give you 4 high quality minutes together in your breakout group to talk about what you read with a very specific question. And the question is, what connections can you make between what you picked up about Mary Parker Follett and her ideas and your world? So Brendan, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, sorry. Enjoy 1 minute to introduce yourselves when you get there. And then 3 minutes, just make sure that you hear from each person. What strikes you? What connections can you make between Mary Parker Follett's ideas and your world? All right. Thanks, Brendan.
No problem. I'm going to send everybody into rooms. And if you happen to find yourself by yourself in a room for a moment, don't panic. I'll move you into a room with other people. No Morehead-Cains left behind. So just bear with me for a moment.
Thank you.
It looks like some people, if some of you may see a little message that invites you to join a room, if you see that, please feel free to go ahead and join that room. Let's see here.
Room 5 needs folks. If you can do 5.
Yep, I'll move Brian to a different room.
Oh, great. Okay. Scoot people around.
And if you like, we can just stay here and have a room conversation ourselves.
This can be a room.
Let's do it.
Okay.
Scott, Mary, and Shireen, I can see all of you. Megan, Brendan. I can't see anyone else's videos, so we're the people who are supposed to be here. Here's what I'm curious about. What connections can you make? Anybody? Yeah, Mary. Oh, we can't hear you.
Can you hear Mary? I can't hear Mary. I see your mouth moving, Mary, but I can't hear you. Oh, strange.
I can have it.
Oh, I bet it was the most brilliant thing that anyone has said all day. Shireen, did you want to say something while Mary gets?
Yes. Mhm. God. Any thoughts? So good to see. Great questions. Great questions. Mary, let's see if we can hear you. I'm curious if there are any connections that you made, and actually, if we can hear them.
Yes, we can.
I feel refreshed every time I read her work, because every time I dip into her work, I realize how forethoughtful she was. And when we all come back together, I'll talk just a little bit about how unusual and how interesting where her insights came from match where we are today. But anyway, I think she's a real, most people don't know her. In fact, Peter Drucker called her let's see.
And
Peter
Julie,
Drucker,
just so you know, I'm going to interrupt real briefly. Just so you know, our other guests will be coming back in about 15 seconds.
awesome, nice job. Peter Drucker said she was the invisible prophet of management. She foresaw. There you go. Hey, it's good to see all of you, and thanks for hanging in there with the technology. Yeah. Awesome. All right. I know that our Fearless Morehead team is supporting the technology, and all of us know that sometimes this Zoom technology is stable for us and sometimes it's not. So let me just do a quick check-in. A thumb up would be, yeah, we were able to connect and have some conversation around Mary Parker Follett's ideas in our lives. Side would be sorta, and down would be like, there was nobody in my breakout. So how about you? How was your experience? Okay, mostly thumbs up, a few to the side. All right, right on. We ended up having a little impromptu breakout party here in the main session. And I want to share just a few things that inspire me around Mary Parker Follett that lead us directly into what I would love to talk about. The first is the irony that we call 7 Talk a talk about new forms of leadership and leading. But Mary Parker Follett was writing about them at the turn of the century. And her work was extraordinary. It was largely in the United States, but it was picked up in Britain and by the Japanese in the 1960s. So if you've ever heard of Toyota's frontline team-based management philosophy, total quality management, all of that came from their study of Mary Parker Follett. And it put them miles ahead on the world stage in terms of how their teams worked together and what their businesses' performance were. One thing that really inspired Mary Parker Follett, and I think makes her an especially interesting insightful guide for today's times are this. Right now, we're working inside, or many of us are working inside organizations that are learning and seeking to integrate not new principles, but the principles of diversity and inclusion and belonging. And we're asking, what does it look like to digest those, to be changed by them, to be reshaped and reformed in terms of how we think about how we organize, how we work together, how we treat each other. And Mary Parker Follett's insights, which were applied to management, came from her work as a social worker in the tenements in Boston, where she worked with a wide range of immigrant groups as they struggled to live together and struggle through their differences and conflict and create lives for themselves and their families. So she learned from watching and working with them that she then brought to leadership and management, again, which were largely ignored, but are now being picked back up again. And I think it's a really good time. So I don't get any money from the sale of her books, but I highly recommend picking up any of Mary Parker Follett's readings and writings. And here's where they take us. Her management philosophy, her idea about how people came together in groups to solve important problems was rooted in a belief that diversity and difference, although they can create tension inside us as primates and as human beings, is actually a creative tension that, if engaged well, that diversity, that tension, conflict even, can actually turn into a creative force that creates new solutions that no single one of us would be able to come up with. And in my world and our work at Deeper, Funner, Change, our little consultancy, we use that idea, collaborative intelligence or group genius, as the basis for how we engage organizations. And I just want to play and share some stories and some of the client stories and some research stories that I find particularly inspiring and see where they take all of us. So the idea of group genius or collaborative intelligence, which was first researched by Tom Malone at MIT maybe 8-9 years ago, is that some groups outperform other groups, controlling for all other variables. And the groups that are the high performers are interacting in very particular ways. They share airspace. They listen deeply to what each person has to say. There aren't long monologues, but instead short contributions that come at different paces. They allow time and space for reflection so that people with an introverted preference have a chance to play to their strengths. And it's not just those with seniority or with an extroverted preference that take up most of the airspace. And they also see contradiction in ideas as an opportunity for integration and new unforeseen ideas to emerge. They also have a very high level of psychological safety. And psychological safety is sort of big in the news right now. When does a sociologist ever get their findings big in the news? But Amy Edmondson, who's been working with psychological safety for over 20 years at Harvard and researching it, sort of hit the headlines when Google did internal research on their highest performing teams and found that psychological safety was the single characteristic that distinguished teams above all other characteristics. So to work with group genius or collaborative intelligence, you need to have a high level of psychological safety. And psychological safety is not what it sounds like. Let me just check. How many people are even familiar with that term? Yeah, oh, okay, all right. So like a third of you. For those who are new to it, psychological safety doesn't mean that you stay feeling safe and comfortable. It doesn't mean that Scott doesn't do something that I find sort of tension producing. What it actually means is that Scott and Leslie and John and Heather and I believe that when we work together as a group, our group is safe. It is okay for us to take interpersonal risks with each other. We can have different ideas. We can give each other feedback. We can contradict each other's positions. We can hold each other to account, and it's not going to hurt our relationships or our careers. So teams that have a high level of collaborative intelligence, like many of Google's highest performing teams And many of the groups that Mary Parker Follett worked with are able to out-innovate, out-decide, and out-create other teams. They have higher levels of profitability and productivity and innovation, learning, and agility. Okay, so that's sort of a bit of the territory. Mary Parker Follett wrote about it early on. Hundreds of years before, there were many indigenous wisdom traditions then and now that still hold many of these principles as important, and they're making a reemergence in today's organizations. So what I want to do is just talk a little bit about an organization that I had the privilege of studying and share a few stories about what this looks like in action, because it's pretty surprising, actually. So here's the first thing. Whenever I have a big question, I go back to school. It's a bit of a disease. In fact, my sister always threatens my nieces and nephews with the fact that I'm persistently in school. She's like, you better do your homework or you're going to end up like Auntie Julie. She's still in school. And the question that I had that sent me to graduate school this last time was, is the relationship between individual and organizational change? Our organizations, our groups don't seem to be able to change very quickly or very nimbly. So I embarked on a doctoral program and decided to find an organization that had gone from top-down command and control, traditional hierarchical leadership, to something radically collaborative, while realizing a dramatic increase in their effectiveness as a business. They were getting better business results. And the questions I was asking was, what did it look like to operate in a radically collaborative way, levels of psychological safety, and how did they make the transition? And my committee told me one night at a late meeting in Chicago that I would never graduate because I would have a very hard time finding that organization to study. I imagined it would be some Silicon Valley, young, hip, cool, design savvy collaboration of people. But the next morning, one of my committee members called the parking lot of a catering company and he said, "You'll never believe this. I have actually just taken a tour of this catering company, which is truly called Tasty Catering. And they have exceptional management practices. They may be the org you're looking for." So a month later, I flew out to Chicago to start studying them. And here are a few things about them. They went from struggling to be profitable to having a profitability level that is twice their industry average. They grew from 35 people to 450 people during their high season. They went from everybody walking on eggshells because they were afraid of what the three owners would say or how they'd react. There were stories of broken whiteboards, thrown desk chairs, and screaming. They went from walking on eggshells to not only being named Best Company to Work For, Caterer of the Year by Catering Magazine, one of Inc.'s best small companies, but one of America's psychologically healthiest workplaces. And they did that in a handful of years. They have an internal university called Tasty University. And they went from being very closely held with the finances a bit of a secret and just the top line shared once a year in retrospect by the three brother owners to having all open book management and profit sharing. So pretty big transition. And there are three stories that I think illustrate some of what helped them make that transition. This is what this stuff looks like in action. Here's the first. One of the stories I heard repeated most often was the story, and this was told actually by the CEO, but by many people about the CEO. CEO's name is Tom. So it's told, actually, he's no longer the CEO. That's a whole other story. One day, the person in charge of marketing sent him out the door with some new business cards, headed to a conference, and he didn't really look at him. He just stuffed him in his pocket. And then at the conference, I think at a cocktail party, he pulled one out and handed it to somebody. And they said, "Oh, wow, that's an interesting title." And he's like, "What do you mean, CEO?" "Oh, that's not what your card says." And the marketing department had decided, actually the company, the Good to Great Council, which I'll talk about in a moment, had decided that they didn't need a CEO anymore. The teams in the company were effectively running the organization. So they called him the Chief Cultural Officer. And his job was to use his social and formal authority, which he still had some of, to reinforce the maintenance and the continued evolution of the company's culture. So Tom tells this story of being in that place, struggling to grow, struggling to be profitable, aware that he's getting older because all of his younger employees were telling stories about technical, he didn't really say apps, but technical features on their phones that he didn't understand. So he's like, man, I'm about to age out here on how to make this business work. And two young up and coming leaders in their early 20s came into his office. They met him at about 7:45 in his cube. And basically, as Tom tells the story, said, change or else. Look, you are missing the boat. This organization, all 35 of us, we are full of good ideas, but the owners won't listen to them. You don't ask, you don't listen, and we're all too scared forward and tell you we have a different idea. We think there's huge potential here, but only if you, the three of you, learn how to really listen to the ideas of the rest of the organization. And by the way, if you don't make that shift, we're going to go somewhere else where we think there is more potential. And as Tom tells it, his face got red. He's a big guy. His face got red. He started to sweat, and all he wanted to say was, get the F out of my office. And then he looked at them and he thought, these are two of my best and brightest. So he said, okay, I have no idea what you're talking about, but if you will lead it, I will support you. So these two young leaders, a little bit surprised, walked away and basically put their heads together to figure out how to engage the whole organization in creating mission, vision, and values and a strategy moving forward would be successful. They ordered copies of Good to Great for everyone. And they didn't really know that Good to Great was a great academically rigorous book with smart ideas. They got Good to Great for everyone because it had a Spanish edition, and 1/3 of their employees were native Spanish speaking. Hispanic from Morelia, a group of 3 had sent and come with most of their family members to escape the drug trade and had been hired by this one catering company. So they got Good to Great for everyone and had everybody read it 1 chapter at a time with study groups. And they created what they called the Good to Great Council. And the Good to Great Council was this: 1 representative from each team in the organization. Now, it's important to know that as soon as it said, you lead it, I'll support you, which was a tremendous act, the two, talked around the rest of the company and said, I think we can shift from like top-down command and control to team-based structure. So they shifted to a team-based structure with team leads on each team. So they did that over about a month. As they say, like, we didn't really know what we were doing. It just seemed like a good idea. It was intuitive to us. They had everyone start reading Good to Great, and they created a Good to Great council where they asked each team to nominate 1 person that they thought could be trusted to listen to the team and then share the team's views in a central meeting. The Good to Great Council met for 2 hours at a time, and these representatives from each team had the job of, after reading a chapter in Good to Great, they had to ask their teams a very, like, what do you think we exist to do? And then come to a Good to Great Council meeting where, and this is just kind of brilliant, these 2 young leaders, not professional facilitators, had the insight to hear from a person at a time. So each team had a voice at the table. Once they'd heard from everyone, the 2 leaders then would help facilitate the first couple of meetings, and then they rotated facilitation. They facilitated the entire group then having a conversation. What are we hearing that's similar? What's different? Where we have different ideas, let's get curious about them. Hear more about what this group was thinking. Hear more what this group was thinking. What connections can we make? And out of that, over a little bit less than a year, they developed a guiding charter, mission, vision, and values, and began cracking some of the organization's gnarliest, thorniest operational challenges. A couple of things happened. the story of the Good to Great Council in this first couple of meetings was another one of the stories that I heard from people all over the organization. And I think there were two striking things. Those who had leadership, brothers, even the two young leaders, described being shocked that the line cooks and the delivery drivers and the wedding planners, amazing insights themselves and from their teams that helped them fairly swiftly build a framework that they were all really proud of for the organization and they found really motivating. So those with formal authority just had the small opportunity to really listen to others' ideas and saw the value. And as soon as they saw it, the way Tom describes it, they were just hooked. They were like, we just wanted to mainline all that value. We couldn't believe we'd been missing it for so long. We wanted to do everything we could to hear as much from people about what problems they saw and how to solve them. On the speaking end, the team representatives were hesitant at first to speak up, but the structure, we call it microstructure, the way these Good to Great meetings were structured, they couldn't be wallflowers, not speak. They were expected to speak up for their team, and the entire room was listening. This was a bit terrifying, but they also felt a big responsibility to speak up for their peers. And as many of them told me, after they did a lot of second guessing, and after the first meeting, they were like, God, I don't know if I did the right thing. Are the owners going to be mad at me now? Am I going to have employment next year? What's this going to look like? But when they came back for their second meeting and they saw that the facilitators had incorporated some of their ideas in the roll-up meeting and the conclusions from the first meeting, and the second meeting was building on ideas that had been influenced by them, they thought, and I pulled this from my research this morning, I saw they listened. My ideas made a difference. For the first time, I knew I had a voice. I mattered. And then, as I see across organization after organization, it's like when you ask people what they think and you really listen, boy, are you going to get it. So they didn't hesitate to speak up as a large group of people. And what we started to see, and what I saw in my research, was people speaking up all over the organization, lifting up problems, challenging each other, and solving them together. This all sounds very Pollyanna, I know, but it's also true. So what have we got so far? We've got Tom, formal leader, leading this shift, his idea. He doesn't know how to do it. He doesn't even like the idea, but he is willing to learn. So one of the first characteristics that I see in this kind of leadership and in readiness for this kind of leadership, this radically collaborative leadership, is being a willing learner, what Google calls being a learning animal. The second thing we've got, Good to Great gathering, this council, which Tim and Jamie didn't know how to construct. They just intuitive to them. I'm calling them young leaders, but they worked in the warehouse. They didn't have formal education around management or leadership. So the Good to Great Council had this really super rigorous structure, and everybody really paid attention to it. Remember, you've got the teams, you've got a representative from the team, there's a question, they ask and they hear from everyone on their team. They know their job is not to represent their own opinion, but represent their team's opinion. They get to the Good to Great Council, very formal process. We hear from each team area one at a time, and we all listen. And then we ask the questions, what's similar, what's different? Let's dig into what's different. What can we learn here? Well, it turns out the way they were interacting is exactly many people who study meeting design, interactions in groups, and collaborative intelligence promote, which is the use of these microstructures in conversation that enable all voices being heard and encourage integration, which Mary Parker Follett talked about a lot, versus debate when you have difference. So we've got those going on, and I see them in all of the organizations that are operating in this way. And there's just a third. I'm telling you that, Megan, so you don't worry too much about time. Here's the third story, again and again and again. The story, and what was it called? That many people gave a name to this story. It differed a little bit. Oh yeah. number 3. It's called number 3. That people refer to. Have you heard the story about number 3? No, what is that? This is the story. About 6 months after the Good to Great had come up with mission, vision, and values, and they were working on a strategic framework for growth, one of the people whose job it was to sell events made a mistake on a project, on an event. She forgot to put into the contract the bar. And what that meant was the company, Tasty, ended up paying $1,400 in beer, wine, and liquor for somebody else's wedding. They didn't get any of it back from the client because it wasn't included as a line item. Well, Tom read this on the report, on the project reports, and he was livid. He was furious. He went right over to the desk of the salesperson, which is right in the middle of their office area, which is not fancy. It's big open cubicles. They're all gray. You know, they're all about this tall. Everybody else's business all day long. And he said to her, "Hey, what about this bar?" And he just lit into her. Again, red face, sweating, furious at her, and actually verbally abusive. She amazingly held her cool, and she stood and she waited while he yelled. She asked him, "Are you finished?" And he went on a little bit more. And then she said, "Is this number 3? And he had no idea what she was talking about. And she pointed over to the wall where Tasty had their values. And the 3rd of 7 values was treat each other with respect. She said, "Is this number 3? And he was still just furious and worked up. He said, "Well, is what you did number 7? Number 7 was own your own circle of discipline, balancing freedom and responsibility to the whole." Brilliant. And this is just amazing. She had the moxie to actually take a breath and say, "No, what I did was not number 7. And I'm sorry." And Tom said, "And the way I just treated you was not number 3. I apologize." And so many people told me it was like this huge sigh, everyone in the whole room in the office had been holding their breath, waiting to hear what was going to happen in this interaction, because here was the same old Tom, but with a different interaction from someone who was lower on the totem pole than he was. And as soon as the two of them then started laughing quietly together and a bit ruefully on Tom's part, everybody else described knowing, okay, so this is for real. We didn't really believe that any of this was for real until we saw it in action and we saw the leaders doing it. And we saw them doing it in public and in a way that showed us that they were learning too and willing to be changed. So I think that 3rd piece there speaks to the importance of psychological safety. Not that it existed beforehand, because in so many ways it didn't. It grew in small increments as the Good to Great counselor. But the fact that the whole organization saw visually, just right up in front of them, an interaction where someone took a risk, an interpersonal risk with her boss. And he responded in a way that was productive for the two of them. So from there, the organization had many stories of times that they had called each other on number 3. And they developed a whole set of norms around what you do when somebody calls you on number 3. Or if you don't want them to call you on it, you just ahead of time and you say, "Brendan, I think I might have violated number 3 with you yesterday," and have that conversation together. And it shifted the whole culture and what was possible. So I think that those 3 stories, at least from my research, really highlight these 3 important elements. The use of structure and microstructures to help us as human beings co-create together, and establishing expectations around how we treat each other and psychological safety, but then living them with each other, especially those who are in positions of formal authority, to show that it's for real. Those three things are game changers in the journey of an organization, from more traditional hierarchical to something that's much more collaborative. And here's where I think I will end. I was delighted the other day, and I'm happy, if it's interesting, in the Q&A to talk about stories like this from our own consulting and experience. And they're every bit as tumultuous as Tom's responses, and every bit as exhilarating as those moments in the Good to Great Council. And they're not always successful, often depending on the ego and identity state of those in formal authority. But I was excited the other day when I cracked open a very new book called Humanocracy, and it's by a strategy guru named Gary Hamel. And Gary Hamel is the first person who said, hey, it's not enough to create a strategic plan, print it out and stick it up on a shelf to get all dusty. Instead, strategy is a living thing. Well, he's just written this book called Humanocracy, and in it are the most unusual, unbelievable, and highly successful organizational designs you can imagine. I'm doing this because so many of them are circular, with teams in the middle and support services around the edge. They range everywhere from Chinese technology manufacturers to Australian nonprofits to nursing and healthcare organizations in the Netherlands, all experimenting with the same basic ethos. How can we liberate the group genius of the people in our organization and create the conditions and the structures that up the likelihood, given who we are as human beings and our tendency to get triggered by each other? So that's what I have to offer, at least to get us. Megan, can I pass back to you?
I would love to be passed back to Julie. I know everybody's feeling the same way I am, sort of bouncing with thoughts and inspiration. And I know we have a question right off the bat from Tom Morris, who would like to explore something with you.
I don't hold back. Hey, that was the most packed 7 minutes of any 7 talk ever. They were 7 minutes in the biblical sense, I think. That was amazing. I had a new insight for me, new to me. A guy from Madrid, Spain came to visit me a year ago. And he said to me, we sat down for breakfast, and he said, what is wisdom? And I gave him the definition that I usually give people. I said, it's embodied insight for living. And if he had asked me that day, as some people have, what are values? I would have said values are our basic commitments. But your story made me make a connection. That day, I didn't just say to the guy from Spain, wisdom is embodied insight for living. I said that, and then I said, you know what wisdom is? It's guidance and guardrails. And as a Spanish speaker, he said, what are guardrails? I said, you know, you're up in the mountains driving around a curvy road. The guardrail's the metal railing that keeps your car from going off the mountain. He said, oh, guardrails, guardrails. I said, wisdom is guidance and guardrails. In the modern world, we concentrate on guidance and we often forget the guardrails. Your story about number 3 made me realize that values can be understood as guidance and guardrails. The same definition of wisdom, which means that our values are an important part of our corporate wisdom, our community wisdom. And that's a connection I'd never made before. So I wanted to thank you for that and ask you what you think.
Before I went to graduate school, I worked for an improv-based consultancy. I was a partner in just thinking about how we might use improvisation. Turns out improvisation is a form of group genius, and that was the red thread running through. But here's why I'm telling you that, Tom. In the improv world, when somebody says something that is just fundamentally true and deeply insightful, all we do is say, thank you. So back at you.
Well, thank you. I mean, you know, for what you said today, and I'll shut up in a second, but for what you said today and what Mary Parker Follett said, I mean, I wrote a little book about these kind of things in the 90s thinking I was doing original stuff. Everybody was talking about product quality and process efficiency. Nobody was talking about the spirit of the people who do the work. So I wrote a book called If Aristotle Ran General Motors, all about truth, beauty, goodness, and unity, and the spirit of the people who work together. And so to discover that there was this woman in management that I didn't know anything about, talking about this 100 years ago, without, first of all, I kind of had neurons go, you blew some neurons out in a very good way. And then to see what you're doing to further this work of understanding leadership and management as a genuinely humane and human endeavor, it's just a wonderful thing. So thank you.
Yeah. One thing I've really learned from my friend Steve Tobin, who's on the call here, and his work in climate action and sustainability is we don't have time to do anything else if we're going to solve the most complex problems that we're facing.
Yeah.
Humanity. We have got to hear all the voices.
Yeah, good point. Thank you.
Yeah, you.
Great. Steve Tobin has his hand up, I believe. Steve, we'd love to hear from you.
It's so great to be in the presence of Julie Huffaker and all of our dear colleagues in this alumni network. I loved working with Julie last year in the design of our sidetracked symposium, but one day. Julie, I'm just so struck by your invocation of Mary Parker Follett, whose work I've admired for decades. My latest leadership guru is Larry Kramer, who runs the Hewlett Foundation. And ever since COVID has locked us all in our homes, Larry has sent out a weekly memo to all of his colleagues in the Hewlett Foundation and in our sister foundation. And what's striking about it is how much he tells about his personal life as informing his decisions around running the Hewlett Foundation, which is a $10 billion foundation with a big footprint in the world. And I have been amazed at how much he has called upon his own life experience outside of the Hewlett Foundation as a way of kind of engaging his colleagues, talking about the travails of his daughter in college, talking about the junk TV he's watching. I'm curious to know what you think the place is in an organization for kind of all of the eccentricities of life that we each bring into the office when we get to go to an office anymore. Does that have an important place, do you think, in the invigoration of the workplace and the performance of an organization?
Oh, yeah. And it can be challenging. So yeah, at least from my standpoint, boy, I would love to hear people's or see people's response in the chat to the, oh yeah, is like there's the most juice in our problem solving together when we are passionate and we feel like we can be bring our whole selves. That's one of the reasons it's actually so fun to get together like this with a group of people who have some shared experience. We can be ourselves, maybe even more than we felt like we could when we were at Carolina. So what I see is organizations that encourage people to bring their real selves, to say what's real for them, even in teeny tiny ways, like meetings begin and end with a one-word checkout, check in, check out. So one word, how are you feeling? Or one sentence, what's true for you? We don't have to spend time. We don't have to, coddle. We don't have to get into drama, just one sentence, what's real for you? And then one word when you're checking out, how do you feel? That makes a huge difference in what happens in the middle of the meeting. So I think there's a huge space for it. I think the and is, and I think there are lots of ways to think about this, but the and is something I learned one time from a yoga teacher. Who used a lot of her own personal experience in her teaching to set up a class. And I told her how much I admired that and how much I learned from it. And she said, and I asked her how she had the courage to do it. And she said, well, in general, I don't bring something to share with others until I can actually say how I feel about it. Because once I can say I feel angry, or I feel frustrated, or I feel let down, or I feel low, then I have it. It doesn't have me. And if it has me, it's acting through me, and I'm not actually holding it and then able to work with it in a constructive way. If it's got me, it's probably not going to help anybody else. And I thought that was a really interesting guideline, which I adopted for myself, because I think there is the fear that we all have of Pandora's box, messy human beings. Are we going to tell each other everything about our personal lives and our drama and demand from each other what feels outside what we're here to do together? Yeah, that's my thought. Thanks. You know, one place that I'm remiss, and I see that right at time, I'm remiss. I can't believe I didn't make these connections. You know, when I was talking about co-creation and structures for co-creating together as a group, my intention was to give us a little sense of that, a little teeny tiny taste in the way we, my hope was to give you a few minutes to research and to think on your own, then to go together and to hear from each other in a breakout. And then if we'd had time to come back, and I would have wanted to hear from each trio because of the technical challenges of that. But here's what I want you to know, and I think this is transformational. The next time you get together with a group, if you don't do this already, if there's a juicy question, a potent question on the table, give everybody 1 minute to reflect on it and invite them to use paper and pen, 1 silent minute, and then invite each person to share 1 different thing that occurred to them. I guarantee it is a changer. If you do that, the conversation that you then have will be completely different and much richer. So you have it here. If you haven't experimented with that way of working, I'd encourage you to give an experiment.
Awesome. I think Kim has a question for you, Julie.
Can never get enough Julie Huffaker. My question is not fully baked yet, so I'm hoping you can just spout out some ideas. But I wondered in your both your studies of these organizational change movements and also your consulting experience more recently, how generational differences, how you've seen that play out in organizations. Sort of, is the idea with Tasty Catering or any of these, just does it come into play at all, or should it not even be a factor?
What do you mean, should it not even be a factor? Can you say
like, you know, is there a place where Tom, or maybe not Tom, let's make it more generic. Is there a place where somebody who's been at it for 30 years, their perspective or opinion on something might carry more weight than somebody who's been there a few months? You know, like, is there a way, I guess, just obviously I would say the answer, it seems, would be yes, but how do you sort of equally respect the input of everyone? Because I totally agree there's value in all of that, while balancing that with just kind of the realities of experience and all of that.
Yeah.
Very, very ineloquent there.
That is a really rich question, Kim. And I have 2 thoughts based on what I've seen in our client organizations. The first is by being super explicit about it. I've got clients that were feeling tension around generations, and our invitation to them and what we supported with them was to actually bring a large diverse group together within the organization and say, we're feeling tension around this. Here's why. We think we hear you saying that we're out of touch. And we look at you and we think you don't have the experience to understand ... So how might we hold both of those things together? And many of you may have read about this. We have clients that have adopted the practice of reverse mentoring. So they literally, you have someone who's in a more mature generation with more experience under their belt, someone who's newer to the workforce but has naive eyes and fresh ideas, meet together regularly, say once every 2 weeks for 3 months, and they just trade off who's the mentor and who's the mentee. They bring each other an issue to work on that the other's perspective might enrich. And that way they're acknowledging each other's expertise and benefiting. That's one thought. I think the other thought, Mary Parker Follett talks about this, also a raw thought. So let me see if I can boil it down. Mary Parker Follett talks about the law of the situation. Steve, I know you know this, familiar with this too, if you've read her work. Basically what she's saying is, let's not pretend, let's not spend time figuring out whose expertise or status or youth should give their opinion more weight. Instead, let's let the reality situation that we're trying to solve, or the problem that we're trying to solve in this situation, give us feedback about which ideas really have legs. She doesn't say really have legs, but you get the point. And the design thinkers call that rapid prototyping. The agilists call that rapid prototyping. Really, theater directors call that letting it get up on stage so everyone can see whether or not it works. So this idea that if you are good enough at quickly implementing ideas in a safe, lo-fi, modest test, it will become apparent to everyone which ideas have legs and which need adaptation. So instead of spending a whole lot of time arguing, well, you whippersnapper, you don't have the expertise, or you're out of touch, just people hear a bunch of ideas, pick something, and actually find a really simple way to try it fast and let the situation give the feedback. Yeah, so that's another thought.
Thanks. I just put in the chat brilliant answers to a very inarticulate question. So thank you.
Wonderful. Well, Julie, you're right. We're up against our time. I will say Ben Cameron has put a really deep thought into the chat, and I'd love to read it. And it may be something that we just, as Tom said, we're all good at homework. I think we should mull over this, and we should reconvene here for further conversation. But Ben, do you want to read it?
Megan,
Yes.
I would like you to read it, but I would just say, for the sake of those that don't know, I used to be a theater director, and I directed Megan in Summerstock in 1983 in Oliver, where she was the definitive Nancy. So just so you know, she can sing as long as he needs me and knock it out of the park. So
I love this man. I love this man. You just look at him and you know what fun we had that summer. Oh my gosh, Ben, I love you so much. I'll sing this instead. Now, Ben says, I know we're shy on time, but I'm struck by the differences that may be at play here between the for-profit sector, where the vision, values, and goals are often fairly established, the Jim Collins mantra of inordinate profitability and longevity, versus the not-for-profit sector, which even Collins acknowledged is greatness defined by mission fulfillment. Especially now, as there are many imperatives of anti-racism, I'm in many meetings where the very nature of the goals and vision and values are deeply contested, and where the idea of a safe space is increasingly consciously set aside in favor of brave space, and where the very nature and behavior and structure of meetings are very different. This would be a great conversation to return to about how the very structures of leadership may be changing in light of new imperatives. Brilliant thought, and so happy, so happy to have that in our, did I see that Emil has his hand raised? Emil, in the class of 24, why don't you wrap us up with a question for Julie? Thank you.
Megan, thank you for extending the time. Apologies, folks, for keeping you late. Julie, I just had a question for you about, as a, someone who is hopefully getting into those leadership roles and who is, but is now kind of doing the grunt work where you, in a hierarchical sense, am not at the top, but closer to the bottom. How do you create those kind of change in systems? And also, how do you encourage other folks within those systems, and both on my level and above and below me, to accept that too?
What a great question. So, Emil, is the essence of your question, I think you said grunt work. How do I, as someone who's sort of doing more grunt work in the organization, help affect change?
Yeah, I suppose, put much more simply, yeah, and practically.
You're giving me too much credit. Can I just ask a favor? Would everybody just go to the chat? 2 sentences. What is your best thinking about Emil's question? We've got leaders and individuals from all kinds of perspectives here. And I'm going to open up the chat so I can watch. Let's just enjoy watching that roll in.
So Julie, will you rephrase the question for us? We'd love to.
Yeah,
sure. Yeah, because as we think.
Okay. And Emil, I'll count on you to tune me up here if I've got this wrong. I think I'm hearing Emil ask, hey, if I'm a leader, I'm an aspiring leader, but my entry position in an organization is kind of, doing the grunt work, down in the bottom of the totem pole. How can I affect change? And I'm just curious what hot tips you would have for Emil based on your experience and what we've been talking about. Nice. Yeah. It's linked to being able to speak to where the audience is listening from. Thanks, Ben. Mary. Making an effort to get to know someone who's different from you. Giving honest feedback to coworkers, regardless of status. Doing things informally that later become more formal. Yeah, making sure to vocalize organizational needs and actively pursue the initiatives that people can support. Be not afraid. Stay resolute. Yeah, great. Just because we're doing the grunt work doesn't mean we can't contribute to the bigger conversation. It takes asserting yourself. Speak up, bring the evidence. That's really nice. Yeah, start with your sphere of influence. Yeah. Nice if you could be in an organization where it's not people above and below you, but around you. Yeah, power with. Don't sell yourself short. See, that's gorgeous. That is just so much better than one person could ever do. And Emil, I'll invite you to dip into, in a 3-minute research fest, communities of practice. Communities of practice by many of my clients are being used as informal mechanisms to create change by inviting people from all parts of organizations to come together around things that they really care about, not unlike the alumni affinity groups, and then discover together based on their passion and their desire to create value towards the organization's mission, like what action could they create? And communities of practice are actually changing the landscape at Google, changing the landscape at a big organization that I work with up in Canada that is doing sustainable design. They are phenomenal and they sit outside the more traditional structure. So check that out.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So beautiful, and still seeing some more group genius happening in the chat. So do avail yourself of all of that as we wrap up. Julie, thank you so much for inspiring all of us with stories of Mary Parker Follett, group genius, psychological safety, and exceptional management practices. We really learned a lot, and I don't know, I just am excited. Thank you.
Awesome. People rock. You folks rock. Thank you so much for coming together to spend time thinking about this.